The Antarctic wind slammed against Aurora Station like a furious, unseen force, rattling the steel walls and whistling through every crack. The snow, thick and endless, danced beneath the station's flickering perimeter lights, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the ice. This place, built to endure the coldest, harshest conditions on Earth, was meant to be a beacon of knowledge. Instead, it felt like a tomb, isolated from the world, buried under an unforgiving sky. Lucas Hadley had been thrilled when he first arrived. As a geologist, he had spent years studying extreme environments, but nothing compared to this, a land where time felt frozen, where the only certainty was the cold. Alongside a small team of scientists and engineers, he had come to unlock the secrets hidden beneath the Antarctic ice. But excitement faded fast in a place like this. Days stretched into weeks. The long, sunless hours blurred together. The station, designed for survival, felt more like a maze of sterile corridors and impersonal rooms. The hum of machines, the occasional crackle of the radio, and the constant howling wind outside were the only sounds that kept them company. Conversations grew shorter, smiles disappeared. Something unspoken hung in the air, a tension none of them wanted to name. Then, one night, the silence was broken. Lucas had been lying in bed, struggling to sleep. His noise-cancelling headphones block out most of the station's ambient sounds, but something cut through, the kind of noise that makes your instincts jolt awake. A sound that didn't belong. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy. At first, he thought maybe someone was just moving around late at night. But something about the sound felt wrong. It wasn't rushed or careless like someone heading to the bathroom or grabbing a midnight snack. It was intentional. Like whoever was walking wanted to be heard. Lucas slowly pulled off his headphones, holding his breath. The footsteps grew louder. Then they stopped. A cold unease crawled over him, different from the chill outside. Sliding out of bed as quietly as he could, he grabbed his jacket and pushed open the door to his small quarters. The hallway stretched before him, dimly lit by the station's overhead emergency lights. Long shadows flickered against the walls with every unsteady flicker of the old bulbs. He took a cautious step forward, listening. As he passed Mira and Ethan's shared room, he hesitated. A muffled sound leaked through the metal door, sobbing. Not loud, but deep, guttural, the kind of crying that comes from someone who's completely lost hope. Lucas reached for the doorknob but stopped himself. Something about that sound made his skin prickle. It wasn't normal grief. It was wrong. His pulse hammered as he forced himself to move on. Whatever was happening, he needed to know. As he neared the cafeteria, a new scent filled the air. Sharp, metallic, foul, blood. The realization hit his stomach like a punch, sending a wave of nausea rolling through him. Swallowing hard, he reached the cafeteria doors. His hand hovered over the handle for a second before he forced himself to push them open. The moment he stepped inside, the world seemed to tilt. The room was wrecked, chairs knocked over, tables flipped, trays of food scattered across the floor like something had torn through with violent force. But Lucas barely noticed the chaos. His eyes locked onto the thing at the center of the room, a massive, rusted steel cross, and nailed to it, his arms stretched wide, his head slumped forward, was Jack, one of the station's maintenance workers. Lucas couldn't breathe. His body locked in place as he took in the horrifying details. Jack's flesh was torn where thick rusted nails pinned him to the cross. Barbed wire wrapped around his wrists, digging into his skin. His work uniform was soaked in blood, dripping steadily onto the floor below. His face, God, his face, was twisted in an expression of pure agony, and yet his eyes were open, staring right at Lucas. Lucas took a step back, his heart hammering against his ribs. His mind screamed at him to run, to move, to do something. But then, Jack moved. His entire body jerked violently, a sickening, bone-cracking sound echoing through the room. His head snapped upward, eyes bulging wide. His mouth opened, and a deep, gurgling gasp tore from his throat. Then he spoke, one word. A name. Belphegor. The sound of it hit Lucas like a physical force. It wasn't just a word, it was something worse, something alive. The air around him seemed to vibrate with it, as if the very walls of the station had heard it too. Lucas stumbled backward, his breath ragged, a scream tearing from his throat as he spun and bolted from the cafeteria. His mind reeled, his vision blurred. He ran, blind with panic, until he slammed into the wall of the corridor and collapsed, gasping for air. The others found him moments later. Their voices, their hands on his shoulders, all felt distant. He could barely form words, barely explain. But when he did, when he managed to choke out what he had seen, they looked at him with something worse than fear. Pity. Still shaking, still breathless, Lucas led them back to the cafeteria, his heart pounding in his ears. But when they stepped inside, nothing was there. No blood, no overturned tables, no steel cross, no Jack. The room was untouched, pristine, like nothing had ever happened. Lucas stood there, frozen in disbelief. He turned to the others, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths. They didn't believe him. He could see it in their faces. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe he was exhausted. Maybe he was losing his mind. But deep down, Lucas knew. Something was here. Something had woken up. And this was just the beginning. The following day, Lucas moved through the station in a fog. The horrific vision haunted his every thought. Jane, the team's therapist, tried to console him, but her calm demeanor failed to mask her growing unease. Outside, the blizzard raged with unrelenting ferocity, sealing them within their frozen prison. That evening, the team gathered in the rec room, a forced attempt to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But the atmosphere was tense. Ethan suggested they check on the geologists, Eric and Carla, who hadn't been seen all day. When they arrived at the couple's quarters, an eerie stillness greeted them. Jane knocked gently, calling their names, but only a muffled sobbing answered. Greg, another maintenance worker, used a master key to unlock the door. The scene inside was a tableau of carnage. Blood painted the walls in violent streaks, dripping from the ceiling and pooling on the floor. The air was thick with the stench of death. Eric lay sprawled on the bed, his throat savagely torn open, his lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. Carla, drenched in blood, sat beside him. She was gnawing on a hunk of raw flesh. Her wild, unrecognizable eyes locked onto the intruders. With a guttural scream, she lunged at them, her movements feral and inhuman. Greg slammed the door shut just in time, his hands trembling as he secured it with anything he could find. The team retreated to the rec room, their unity crumbling under the weight of fear. That night, Lucas lay awake, the sound of footsteps and childlike laughter echoing faintly through the station's halls. By morning, the team's numbers had dwindled further, their absence a suffocating reminder of the invisible terror stalking the station. Outside, the storm continued its relentless siege, its howling winds rattling the steel walls, as if mocking their futile hope of escape. The pale light of dawn brought no comfort, only a deepening sense of dread. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified into a harbinger of doom. A sudden, thunderous explosion shattered the fragile silence. The ground quaked beneath their feet, the vibrations coursing through the station like a warning bell. Hearts pounding, the remaining team rushed to the observation deck, their breath misting in the frigid air. What they saw outside turned their blood to ice. Flames roared against the snow, a violent eruption of light and heat that devoured the white landscape. At the heart of the inferno stood a figure, its outline distorted by the rippling heat. Jane. Her silhouette writhed, her arms outstretched in an agonized dance as the fire consumed her. Her screams, raw and primal, pierced the air, each cry more haunting than the last. They could do nothing but watch, frozen by the horror of the moment, as her charred form finally crumpled into the flames. The fire's glow reflected in their wide, unblinking eyes, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. The survivors, Lucas, Eleanor, Greg, and Marcus, stumbled back from the deck, their minds reeling, their hopes snuffed out like a candle in the wind. The once unyielding bonds of their camaraderie began to fray under the weight of terror and suspicion. Each passing moment in the station felt heavier, as though the walls were closing in, suffocating them in their shared despair. The nights that followed became a blur of fractured whispers and distant, unexplained sounds. Sleep offered no solace, only fractured dreams that bled into reality. The oppressive atmosphere bore down on Elena the hardest. Once a pillar of calm, she began to withdraw, her haunted eyes betraying a mind teetering on the edge. When she failed to appear one morning, Lucas went searching, his pulse quickening with every step. He found her in the observatory. The room, bathed in the cold glow of the station's emergency lights, felt impossibly still. Eleanor's body lay slumped against the wall, a syringe still clutched in her lifeless hand. Her face, pale and serene, contrasted sharply with the turmoil that had preceded her final act. Beside her, a hastily scrawled note rested, the ink smudged, as if written with trembling hands. Lucas picked it up, but the words blurred before his eyes, their meaning lost amidst the cacophony of his spiraling thoughts. He stood there, the weight of her absence settling over him like a shroud. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to their suffering. Lucas sat alone in the dim glow of the failing emergency lights, his hands trembling as he flipped through the brittle, yellowed pages of an old research log. The truth unraveled before him in frantic, half-legible scrawls, entries filled with desperation, guilt, and the kind of madness that came from realizing you had created something you could never contain. The previous research team had never just been here for climate studies. Buried beneath the ice, hidden from the world, they had conducted something far darker, a secret project, a weapon, a pathogen designed to strip the mind of its barriers, to erode reason and reality itself. The scientists had believed they could control it. They were wrong. Lucas swallowed hard, his breath shallow. The symptoms, paranoia, hallucinations, violent delusions, were all there. The whispers, the shadows moving in the corners of his vision, the scent of blood where there was none. It had never been about some ancient entity clawing its way into their world. Belphegor. The name had haunted him, creeping into his thoughts, whispered in the wind, and breathed through unseen lips. But it wasn't a demon. It wasn't supernatural at all. It was a project name, a code name for the thing that had taken them all. His stomach lurched as he looked at his hands, the ink-stained fingers that had been writing, scribbling nonsense into his own journal for days. Weeks. He wasn't sure anymore. Somewhere in the wreckage of his mind, a single, horrifying thought took root. He had been infected since the beginning. His breath hitched, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. Slowly, he turned toward the shattered remains of a mirror on the far wall. A figure stared back at him. It wore his face, but it wasn't him. The eyes were wrong, black, hollow, bottomless pits that swallowed all light. Its skin was cracked like porcelain stretched too thin. Its lips curled into a smile, too wide, too knowing. Lucas staggered backward, but the reflection didn't move. It simply watched, and then it spoke. The voice was his own, but layered, distorted, as if something else lurked beneath his words. "You were never meant to leave." Lucas gasped, his back hitting the cold metal wall. His vision blurred as a wave of dizziness washed over him. The room twisted, the walls stretching and contracting like a living thing. Reality itself seemed to fray at the edges, unraveling into something unrecognizable. He clutched at his temples, trying to force his mind back into place. But the voices wouldn't stop. The whispers slithered through the air, curling around his ears, filling the empty spaces between his thoughts. He couldn't let it take him. He wouldn't become another nameless ghost in this cursed place. With shaking hands, he grabbed the emergency flare gun from the supplies rack. The metal felt warm in his grip, pulsing like a heartbeat. He barely noticed as he loaded a flare into the chamber, his fingers moving on instinct. The mirror still stood before him, his monstrous reflection grinning wider now. He raised the gun. The crimson glow of the flare lit up the room, casting flickering, grotesque shadows across the walls. The wind outside screamed, rattling the station with a fury that matched his own spiraling thoughts. Lucas took one last, shuddering breath and pulled the trigger.